This is not the version that the story told, but the version it has tried to hide.
With the priest position left vacant after the death of Lucius Cornelius, it seems that Caesar's luck is finally about to turn. Can you believe it? Before the world-famous Caesar became known to all, he was actually a debt-ridden playboy, owing more money than the annual salaries of 18 Roman legions combined. So how exactly did he end up owing such a huge amount? At the age of 27, Caesar was appointed as a Roman priest, which meant he no longer had to hide from Sulla's men, and could live openly in Rome. At the same time, he also became a tribune commander in the Roman legion. A tribune commander had 6 centurions under his command, which means Caesar led 600 soldiers. In a Roman legion, there were 10 tribune commanders like Caesar, so this promotion was hardly worth mentioning for someone destined to become Caesar the Great. Moreover, even after becoming a tribune commander, Caesar had no opportunity to prove himself, because in the very year he was elected, the Spartacus slave uprising broke out in Rome, and during this period, Caesar remained stationed in the capital. The regular Roman army was utterly routed, and at this point, Rome was already facing a shortage of capable men. Pompey, the only competent general, was away in Spain. Rome was truly out of options, so they had Crassus lead 8 legions to suppress the Spartacus uprising. 8 legions meant there were 80 tribune commanders, and even so, no one thought Caesar was worthy of being even one out of those 80. After Crassus wiped out Spartacus, Pompey also returned triumphantly from Spain. All the attention of the Roman citizens was focused on these 2 men. No one cared at all about how Caesar was doing. In fact, Caesar was actually doing quite well. Although he wasn't famous in Roman politics, he was well known in other areas. For example, he was very popular among Roman women, and the amount of money he borrowed was also quite famous. When Caesar was elected quaestor at the age of 30, his total debt had already reached 300 talents, which was equivalent to the annual wages of 110 soldiers. So in the previous episode, when Caesar proactively asked the pirates to raise his ransom, it actually didn't bother him at all. So where did all of Caesar's borrowed money go? Let's help him do the math. First and foremost, it's about investing in yourself. Caesar was a lover of books. His reading volume was so impressive that even Cicero, who was recognized as the foremost intellectual of the time, deeply admired him for it. At that time, books were written on expensive papyrus, so just reading alone cost a fortune. In addition, Caesar was someone who cared a great deal about his appearance. The togas worn by ancient Romans were not just pieces of cloth casually draped over the body. The thickness of the fabric, and the way the folds were made, were both highly particular. If you were a member of the Senate, your toga also had to be trimmed with a red border. Underneath the toga, they wore short-sleeved tunics. Ancient Romans wore short-sleeved tunics all year round. The only difference was the thickness of the fabric depending on the season, the type of belt used with the tunic, the kind of buttons on the belt, and how the tunic's pockets were decorated. All of these details could be quite particular. Normally, only minors, ordinary citizens, and slaves would go out wearing just a tunic. If someone had status, they would also wear a cloak when going out, and the brooch used to fasten the cloak was also a carefully chosen accessory. The cloak would also be dyed, with purple being the most expensive color, so only triumphant generals were allowed to wear purple cloaks. After ancient Rome entered the imperial era, purple was even considered the exclusive color of the emperor, with red being second only to purple. In movies, we often see ordinary soldiers wearing red cloaks, but in reality, that's just for visual effect. That was just for appearances. It doesn't reflect historical fact. The second major reason for Caesar's massive loans was for socializing. Since Caesar came from a noble family, he naturally had many friends and clients. To put it simply, clients were Caesar's fans, but there was still a significant difference between the 2 relationships. For example, when Caesar, as a patron, needed to run for office, these clients had to show their support for him, something today's fans can also do. But when the clients encountered difficulties, Caesar was also expected to help them out, something today's idols might not necessarily do. Moreover, Caesar was especially generous to his clients, so you can imagine how much money this alone would require. The third major reason for Caesar's huge debts was giving gifts to his lovers. Although Caesar wasn't wealthy, his looks were also rather average. Fortunately, Caesar knew how to present himself. He had a firm grasp on cultivating his own charisma, and combined with his generosity, this made him very popular among the women of Rome's upper class. In any case, the heavily indebted Caesar took office as a quaestor in Spain, and his year in Spain was just as unremarkable as before. At this point, all the main characters who would shape the history of Rome at the end of the Republic had already made their appearances, yet apart from his reputation as a playboy, there was nothing about Caesar that suggested he would accomplish anything noteworthy. But after Caesar returned to Rome, he finally revealed his ambition to the world. You might not know this, but everything people know about Caesar the Great comes from after he turned 40, because it was only at 40 that Caesar began his rise. Yet few people know just how much of a showman Caesar was before his rise to power. At the age of 32, Caesar lost 2 close family members in succession, his aunt and his wife. Caesar's aunt was the wife of Marius, the great hero of the populares. Since Marius's son was killed during the civil war with Sulla and Marius had no other children, it fell to Caesar to preside over his aunt's funeral. In ancient Rome, funerals were taken much more seriously than weddings, and for a noble family like Caesar's, the ceremonies were especially grand. The funeral procession would set out from the family home and proceed all the way to the Roman Forum, with ordinary citizens joining in the mourning along the way. So this was a memorial service that attracted the attention of the entire populace. Caesar's eulogy at the memorial was remarkably bold. He began by elevating the status of his own family, claiming that the blood of the goddess Venus flowed in the veins of the Julii clan. Then came the crucial part. At Roman funerals, it was customary to create wax figures or masks modeled after ancestors or family members to accompany the deceased. The wax figure that Caesar had made was none other than Marius, the great hero of the populares. However, Marius had not yet been cleared of the charge of treason imposed by Sulla, and at this time Rome was still dominated by Sulla's faction. So to display the wax figure of a public enemy of the state in front of everyone was practically courting disaster. Marius had been dead for 18 years, and during Sulla's dictatorship, the people of Rome weren't even allowed to mention his name. Now, seeing their great hero appear once more, the spark that had long been extinguished in their hearts was rekindled. This also hinted at Caesar's ambition to revive the populares, the faction that had been crushed by Sulla. Fortunately, the Roman elites didn't take this playboy Caesar seriously at all, so his actions didn't bring him any trouble. And as for the common people, they were just reminiscing about Marius. They didn't think Caesar could stir up any real waves either. At this moment, all eyes were on Pompey, who was at the height of his power. In 67 BC, Pompey applied to lead a campaign to wipe out the pirates in the Mediterranean, and he accomplished this in just 89 days. It took only 89 days to resolve the pirate problem that had plagued the region for years. After Pompey wiped out the pirates, he went east to expand the empire, while Caesar could only engage in charitable activities in Rome. Caesar first undertook a large-scale renovation of the Appian Way, which had been laid down in 312 BC. This road remains bustling with traffic even today. Caesar also held grand gladiatorial games, which were the favorite form of entertainment for ancient Romans. He also took the opportunity to restore the Marius Victory Monument, which had been destroyed by Sulla. Heaven rewards the diligent thanks to Caesar's series of maneuvers. His debts finally went from enormous to astronomical. Because Caesar paid for all these public works out of his own pocket, the Roman commoners began to take notice of him and helped him successfully get elected to the position of Pontifex Maximus. The Pontifex Maximus was the most powerful of all the priests. As soon as Caesar took office, he moved into the official residence reserved for the Pontifex Maximus, which was very close to the Roman Forum perhaps, so he could better listen to the voices of the people. Caesar never changed his residence until he was assassinated. Not long after becoming Pontifex Maximus, Caesar began to take action against the Senate. He encouraged his good friend, the tribune Labienus, to bring an elderly senator to court on the grounds that, 37 years ago, when he was consul, he had killed the then tribune. In fact, Caesar wasn't deliberately picking on the old man. What he really wanted was to use this case to seize the Senate's most powerful weapon, the Senate's final decree. Originally, the Senate was simply a body for decision-makers to discuss matters. It had no actual decision-making power itself. The so-called Senate decree was merely the Senate's advice submitted to the decision-makers. However, during the Hannibalic War, many matters required rapid response, so the Senate's decrees gained real decision-making power. But after the Punic Wars, this method of decision-making continued to be used. Later, in order to oppose the reforms of the Gracchi brothers, the Senate even issued the Senate's final decree. Once this decree was issued, the consul could execute anyone deemed guilty by the Senate without any trial. Many later reform-minded tribunes also died as a result of the Senate's final decree. The old man whom Caesar wanted to prosecute was precisely the consul who had carried out the Senate's final decree back then. As long as Caesar could win this case, he would be able to prove that the Senate's final decree was a mistake, and thus could logically abolish this decree. But what Caesar didn't expect was that Cicero, who had already been elected consul, wanted to use this opportunity to establish an image of justice, and actually took the stand himself to defend this now dispensable old man. If Caesar and Labienus didn't want to lose the case, they had to change their strategy. So Caesar staged a farce, having people raise a red flag on the hill to warn everyone that an enemy was approaching. As a result, no one cared about the trial anymore. Everyone went home to prepare for war. The lawsuit ended in confusion amid the farce, but Caesar did not give up on his goal. Next, he would pay a heavy price in order to oppose the Senate's ultimate decree. Caesar could truly be called the playboy of ancient Rome. He had affairs with many married women, and this was already an open secret. The women Caesar had affairs with were all famous noble women of the time, such as Tertulia, the wife of Crassus, one of Rome's first triumvirate, Mucia, the wife of Pompey, another member of the triumvirate, and Lollia, the wife of Gabinius, Pompey's deputy. His wife, Aurelia, and his sister-in-law, Servilia, who was also the mother of Brutus, the main conspirator in Caesar's later assassination. The details about Caesar's affair with Brutus's mother are thoroughly documented in Sallust's work, The Conspiracy of Catiline. Like Pompey, Catiline was once one of Sulla's most capable lieutenants, but later on, he was left far behind by Pompey. Catiline had another thing in common with Caesar. Both of them were burdened with enormous debts. Roman men were always known for their simplicity and frugality, but after Rome came to dominate the Mediterranean, all kinds of luxury goods flooded into the city, and people got swept up in a buying frenzy. As a result, taking out loans became commonplace, especially for prominent figures like Catiline and Caesar. No amount of money they borrowed ever seemed to be enough to spend. Of course, compared to Caesar, Catiline's debts were insignificant, but even so, the burden of debt still broke Catiline's spirit to the point where he planned to default. When Catiline was running for consul, he declared, "If I get elected, I'll wipe out everyone's debts." Naturally, as soon as this kind of statement came out, the Senate was firmly opposed. So, led by Cicero, members of the Senate began using all sorts of underhanded tactics to prevent Catiline from being elected. As a result, Catiline ran for consul 3 years in a row but failed each time, which began to warp his character. He decided to plot against Cicero and others. However, because his plan was riddled with flaws, it became an open secret. At that time, the consul Cicero specially convened a Senate meeting on the 23rd of September, 63 BC, requesting the issuance of the Senate's final decree, which meant executing Catiline without any trial. However, most senators refused Cicero's request on the grounds that there was no evidence. And on this very day, there was also a senator who arrived late. His reason for being late was that he had just bathed a child, the newborn baby, who would later become Rome's first emperor, Augustus. Later, people began to suspect that someone was orchestrating things behind Catiline. The people suspected were Crassus and Caesar. Because Pompey was Crassus's rival and was about to return in triumph, Crassus wanted to take control of Rome before Pompey came back. So, the richest man in Rome incited the heavily indebted Catiline to stage a military coup. The reason for suspecting Caesar was much simpler. Caesar had the highest debts in Rome, so if Catiline really managed to wipe out all debts, the person who would benefit the most would be Caesar. To clear up the rumors, these two each used their own methods. No one knows where Crassus got a whole pile of letters to prove his innocence, while Caesar, as a suspect, was actually being targeted. This was because Caesar's anti-Senate words and actions were becoming increasingly bold, and many senators hoped to use this opportunity to expel Caesar from the Senate. The loudest among them was the 32-year-old Cato the Younger. As the Senate's eloquent orator, he persistently targeted Caesar, insisting that Caesar was the mastermind behind Catiline. So while everyone was discussing how to deal with Catiline, Caesar hurriedly wrote a letter at his seat and handed it to his servant. Shortly after the servant left, he returned with another letter and handed it to Caesar. Cato the Younger saw all of this and was convinced that Caesar was secretly communicating with Catiline's faction. So he publicly accused Caesar and demanded to inspect Caesar's correspondence. Caesar explained that it was just his personal letter, but Cato refused to let it go. Caesar had no choice but to... There was no other way, so the letter had to be handed over to Catullus. After reading the letter, Catullus's face turned bright red with embarrassment, and then, in a fit of angry shame, he scolded Caesar, calling him a real womanizer. All the senators present burst into laughter. It turned out that the letter was a love letter from Catullus's sister-in-law, Servilia, to Caesar, and every word was filled with the unmistakable scent of romance. From then on, Catullus was too embarrassed to bother Caesar anymore. More than 2 months later, Catiline finally began to take action. He organized people to assassinate Cicero for the sake of the country. Cicero urgently convened a Senate meeting and delivered his historically famous speech impeaching Catiline. This impassioned speech of his has been regarded as a model ever since. Even today, many European high school students are still required to translate this passage. The speech mainly denounced Catiline, and in the end, Catiline was scolded so harshly that he left Rome. After leaving Rome, Catiline began to recruit troops. However, before Catiline could raise his army, 5 of his accomplices were caught. Among them was a sitting praetor and member of the Senate, which shocked everyone. As a result, the Senate issued the ultimate senatus consultum, final decree of the Senate. But Cicero, as Rome's top lawyer, felt that executing these 5 people without any trial violated his professional ethics. It was essentially depriving Roman citizens of their right to appeal. As consul, Cicero did not want to take the blame, because it was originally the consul's responsibility to carry out the Senate's final decree. However, he shifted the matter to the Senate, letting the Senate collectively discuss what should be done. This gave Caesar an opportunity to make his move. Caesar proposed that everyone should be tolerant, saying that Rome had come this far thanks to the tolerance and magnanimity of their ancestors. So Caesar suggested imprisoning these 5 people. In fact, Caesar didn't really care about the fate of these 5. What he wanted was to use this incident to oppose the Senate's final decree. If these 5 were not executed, the Senate's final decree would essentially become invalid. As long as there was a precedent, it would be much easier to strip the Senate of this power in the future. Originally, the Senate all supported executing these 5 people immediately, but after hearing Caesar's speech, it really was as if they'd heard something persuasive. Their attitudes actually began to change. Seeing this, Cato the Younger quickly stepped forward to refute Caesar. Clearly, hearing Cato's speech was even more convincing than hearing Caesar's. Everyone then decided once again to execute these people immediately. When Cato the Younger left the assembly, he was welcomed by the crowd like a triumphant general, while Caesar, upon leaving, was actually mobbed and beaten by the crowd. If his friends hadn't rushed over in time, Caesar might very well have been beaten to death and then thrown into the Tiber River to feed the turtles. That very night, Cicero had those 5 people executed. Because of this, Cicero also earned the reputation of being the father of the nation. Shortly after the execution of Catiline's 5 accomplices, the rebel army that Catiline had gathered was also wiped out. In 62 BC, Catiline's conspiracy was finally and completely crushed. At this time, Pompey also returned in triumph, and the first triumvirate of Rome was about to be formed. Have you ever seen anyone as shameless as Caesar? He allowed himself countless affairs, yet would not tolerate his wife being unfaithful even once. At that time, among the noble women of Roman high society, Caesar was the only man for whom they were willing to line up and wait for his favor. Some historians have even pointed out that the wives of 1/3 of the senators in the Senate had affairs with Caesar. Yet, despite being such a man, Caesar decisively divorced his wife simply because she was suspected of infidelity. Every December in ancient Rome, during the Saturnalia, all those holding important positions had to hold a festival for the goddess Bona at home. Since men were strictly forbidden from participating in this event, Caesar had to spend the night as a guest at someone else's house. At Caesar's home, the event was organized by his mother Aurelia, and the noble women of Roman high society gathered together there. However, just after the festival began, a servant in Caesar's house discovered a man dressed as a woman. Caesar's mother immediately recognized him. It was Pulcher from the Claudius family. Pulcher was also a prominent figure, so Caesar's mother did not hand him over to the guards. The reason Pulcher disguised himself as a woman and sneaked into the festival was because he had fallen in love with Pompeia. Pompeia was Caesar's second wife. This scandal quickly became the talk of the town among the noble women attending the festival. Caesar's opponents finally had an excuse to impeach him, because Caesar was not only a praetor, but also Rome's chief priest. Such a blasphemous act happening in the chief priest's own home was seen as a clear case of Caesar neglecting his duties. Meanwhile, the general public was also laughing at Caesar, because a man who had always been involved with other men's wives was now, ironically, being cuckolded himself. Everyone was curious to see how Caesar would handle the public relations crisis. Caesar truly lived up to his reputation, immediately distanced himself from those involved by divorcing his wife. However, Caesar's opponents refused to let the matter go and brought Pulcher to court. Caesar's mother claimed that it was too dark at the time and she couldn't see clearly. The maids in Caesar's household also insisted that they didn't know who it was. Caesar also claimed that he was not present at the scene that day, so he could not provide any testimony. The chief judge then asked Caesar, "If that's the case, why did you still divorce your wife Pompeia?" Caesar replied, "As the wife of Caesar, she must be above any suspicion whatsoever." As soon as he said this, everyone fell silent. Because in ancient Rome, the higher up in society a woman was, the more assertive she tended to be. Not only did they have property rights, but political marriages were also very common. In other words, their fathers-in-law were not people to be trifled with. That's why there were so many senators who were afraid of their wives. They felt that Caesar was truly manly, saying out loud what they themselves never dared to say to their own wives. In any case, with that statement, Caesar managed to defuse the crisis of being removed from his position as Pontifex Maximus. Pulcher was also acquitted. As expected, the matter was considered settled. But as it turned out, the unexpected still happened. At this point, the big shot Cicero made his entrance. In court, Pulcher claimed that on the night in question, he was at his villa 100 kilometers outside of Rome. But Cicero testified that Pulcher had visited him that very morning. How could he possibly have traveled so far in just half a day? At this point, the jury was more inclined to believe the testimony of the former consul, Cicero. At this critical moment, Rome's richest man, Crassus, also stepped in. He used his unique abilities to completely win over the jury, and only then was Pulcher acquitted. From then on, Pulcher swore to take revenge on Cicero, that big shot. However, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Later, when Caesar went to campaign in Gaul, he deliberately promoted Pulcher, the very man who had nearly ruined his own reputation. With Pulcher keeping an eye on the Senate for him in Rome, Caesar could rest easy without worries back home. In 61 BC, Caesar was sent to Spain to serve as provincial governor. He had been to Spain once before, but at that time he was just a minor financial inspector. But this time, as provincial governor, he also held command over 2 legions. However, instead of being able to take up his new post with honor, Caesar couldn't even leave his own house, because his creditors had blocked him at his doorstep. Once again, it was Crassus who used his extraordinary influence to act as guarantor, allowing Caesar to go to Spain and assume his position smoothly. Crassus had previously helped Caesar keep his position as Pontifex Maximus, and now he was acting as Caesar's guarantor again. So, what exactly was Crassus after? In fact, Crassus was protecting his biggest debtor. If anything went wrong with Caesar, all the gardens he had lent him would be wasted. Most of the money Caesar borrowed was used for public welfare, such as repairing roads and hosting gladiator games. As for the money spent on gifts for his lovers, that was just a drop in the bucket. But because of public opinion, Crassus had no choice but to keep lending money to Caesar, and Caesar made full use of this method. In his own work, Commentaries on the Civil War, Caesar even wrote that he would borrow money from his centurions and captains, and then distribute the borrowed money as bonuses to his soldiers. In this way, the commanders would work hard for Caesar in order to get their money back, and the soldiers, grateful for Caesar's generous generous bonuses, would fight with exceptional bravery. So, Caesar accomplished his revolution using other people's money. We all know that the three great figures of ancient Rome were Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, but in reality, the relationship among the three of them was not very good. First of all, Pompey and Crassus were competitors, and then Caesar cuckolded both Pompey and Crassus. In addition, Caesar also signed a huge loan for Crassus. If that's the case, why did they form the three-headed bronze wolf? What benefits were so great that they were willing to set aside their grudges and form an alliance? Now that they had allied, who was their common enemy? We all know that Caesar went to southern Spain to serve as provincial governor in 61 BC. Before taking office, Caesar saw that Pompey was about to hold his third triumph, and he was so envious it made his teeth itch. Meanwhile, Caesar was already 39 years old and still had no children. So during his tenure in Spain, he took the opportunity to take a trip around Portugal. This was also the first time Caesar saw the Atlantic Ocean. At that time, the region of Portugal had not yet been incorporated into the Roman territory. Caesar went to Portugal to prove that he, too, had expanded Rome's frontiers, so that he could hold a triumph like Pompey. But what Caesar didn't know was that Pompey's life was not something that should have made him so envious. Before Pompey returned to Rome, the Senate had always worried that he would use his army to assert his own power. But unexpectedly, Pompey was quite disciplined. He disbanded all his legions as soon as he got back. With their concerns now gone, the Senate listened as Pompey made 4 requests outside the city of Rome. First, to allow him to hold a triumphal parade. Second, to let him run as a candidate for consul in 60 BC. Third, to allocate farmland to his soldiers as a form of pension. Fourth, to recognize the reform plans he had promised to the various provinces in the east after reclaiming them. As a result, the Senate began to equivocate with Pompey, agreeing to let him hold a triumph, and also allowing him to run for consul in the following year. However, according to ancient Roman custom, a general awaiting a triumph was not allowed to enter the city of Rome, while running for consul required the candidate to personally submit an application on Capitoline Hill inside the city. The Senate deliberately created a scheduling conflict by changing the deadline for submitting the application. In other words, if Pompey held his triumph, he would not be able to submit his application on time. If he submitted his application on time, he would not be able to hold his triumph. Then there was the issue of allocating farmland to Pompey's soldiers and recognizing Pompey's promises made in the east.
Subscribe to Animystika not to miss anything. Like and share, and join me right away for a new trip in history.